The crowd saw a purchase, but he saw the woman who would change his soul.
The Prescott Trading Post stank of sweat, whiskey, and unspoken regret. Flies buzzed lazy circles over half-empty mugs, and the wooden beams groaned under the weight of heat and watching men. Along the corral rail stood a cowboy whose silence was more legend than presence. He didn't lean like the others did. He simply stood, tall and still, boots planted in the dust as if he'd been born there. His hat shaded a face carved by years of wind and ash, and though his lips never moved, something in his eyes spoke of storm survived. Folks called him Trace. Nobody knew if it was a first name or the only one he had left. He had a limp that slowed him, but never weakened him. It wasn't the kind that begged pity, just a fact, like the iron revolver that hung low on his hip, untouched and unthreatened. Trace hadn't spoken a word in years, not since the war, or the raid, or whatever ghost had sealed his throat shut. No one knew for sure. They just knew he was the kind of man who could disappear into a silence so deep it swallowed even memories. The Navajo trader climbed onto the flatbed cart with a grunt, dust billowing around his cracked boots. He didn't call for attention. There was no need. Everyone within earshot was already watching. Word had gone round since morning. A woman would be auctioned before sundown. Apache. Young. Blind. Trace didn't shift, didn't blink, as the trader unwrapped a blanket from her shoulders and let it fall to her feet. She stood barefoot, motionless, her posture erect, though her eyelids hung low and unseeing. Her eyes were pale, clouded over like frost on still water. She held a cane, a simple cut of pine, smooth and polished by touch, and her hands curled loosely around it with the calm of someone who didn't expect kindness but refused to accept pity. The murmur started slow. Blind, they say. Can't even cook, let alone see a fence post. Why'd they bring her here? No one's that desperate. She didn't flinch at the voices, didn't react as men squinted, jeered, or turned away. Her face was carved with the same quiet as Trace's, distant, patient, somehow untouchable. She wasn't shamed. She wasn't pleading. She was waiting. The trader looked around, mouth dry. Starting at $5, he said. Healthy, young. Speaks Apache and some English. No one moved. Boots scuffed dirt. Chairs creaked. A bark of laughter came from the saloon door. $5 was nothing for a woman. $5 was everything for this woman. A pause stretched long enough to echo. Then Trace stepped forward. The scrape of his boot against the plank stirred heads. Coins clinked in his hand as he reached into his coat and pulled out a silver eagle. No words. No negotiation. Just a coin, laid flat on the cart's splintered edge. The trader froze. Then nodded. He knew better than to question silence backed by steel. Men muttered behind their drinks. What's he want with a blind Apache? Maybe he's gone soft. Or maybe just gone. But Trace didn't hear them. Or maybe he did. He just didn't let their voices in. He turned to her, nodded once. She didn't speak, only shifted slightly as if feeling a change in the wind. Then she lifted her cane, stepped down from the cart with practiced grace, and followed the rhythm of his footsteps. They walked past the general store, past the watering trough where boys threw pebbles and horses stirred. No one stopped them. Some watched. Others looked away. The street had never known a stranger pair. He, the voiceless drifter marked by things he wouldn't speak. She, the blind woman with nothing but a cane and her name lost to history. And yet, something about the way they moved, side by side, untethered yet drawn by gravity itself, made the town hold its breath for just a moment. Trace didn't take her by the arm. She didn't reach for his. Their steps adjusted, his slowing to hers, hers speeding to his. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't courtesy. It was something older than that. The trail leading away from Prescott was dry and narrow, cut through low brush and redstone. Trace rode a dun mare that plodded steady beside the woman, who walked without complaint, her hand resting lightly on the mare's flank as though she could sense direction through its breathing. The sun dropped behind them, throwing long shadows across the mesa, and still they said nothing. At twilight, Trace stopped near a stream where cottonwoods leaned over the water like old men in prayer. He dismounted, struck a flint, and built a small fire. She sat across from him, legs folded beneath her, the glow of the flame catching the edges of her cheekbones and the curve of her lip. She turned toward him, not with her eyes, but as if the air told her where he was. "You paid $5, she said. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head. Just sat still. You didn't ask who I was, she added. Her voice was neither bitter nor grateful. It was a statement, like the fire, like the darkness, like the silence between them. Trace reached into his saddlebag and drew out a piece of dried meat, placing it near her on a flat stone. She reached for it slowly, testing the air, her hand brushing it with practiced fingers. "Do you speak?" she asked after a while. He looked at her. The fire cracked. "Or have you forgotten how?" she said. His eyes flicked to hers, clouded but piercing. He didn't answer, but something in his chest shifted, like a stone finally stirred by rain. She tilted her head, listening. "It's all right," she said. "There's a lot the world forgets." The stars stretched out overhead, bright as lantern flames across the endless dome. Coyotes howled from the rim of the ridge, and somewhere, a night bird called once and fell quiet. Trace didn't sleep. He watched her as she drifted off, her breathing soft, her fingers curled near the cane resting beside her like a sentinel. She looked peaceful, not helpless. And he, who had ridden alone for years, felt something unfamiliar stir in the space between their shared silence. By morning, she woke before him. "I dreamed of singing," she said, sitting up. "I used to sing once, in the canyon near my village. The echo was the best part, like someone was always listening." Trace didn't smile, but he looked at her longer than usual. They traveled slow for the next 2 days, through juniper groves and past carved rock walls where ancient hands had left their mark. He showed her the path with his steps, warned her of sharp drops with the tap of his boot. She never stumbled. Her feet learned him faster than most men could learn a horse. At one narrow pass, a rattlesnake stirred in the grass. Trace drew his revolver, not with flair, but with precision. He aimed low, but she raised a hand. "No need," she said calmly. "It hears us. It'll leave." He lowered the gun, watched, and sure enough, the snake slithered off, disappearing into the chaparral. "You trust what you can't see?" he asked, not with his mouth, but with the lift of his brow. She turned her face toward him. "You do it every day," she said. When they finally reached his cabin, a single-room shelter tucked beside a slope of red earth and cottonwood, she stopped just outside the door. Reached out, fingers touching the frame, the grain of the wood, the pattern of its age. "Home?" she asked. Trace nodded. "Yours?" He paused, then nodded again, slower this time. She smiled faintly. "Then I'll listen to it. Wood remembers things. It'll tell me where not to trip." He opened the door for her, and she stepped inside, unafraid. That night, she sat by the hearth, her fingers tracing the worn lines in the stone floor. "You didn't buy me," she said softly. "You bought a moment. That's different." Trace, sitting across from her, met her gaze, those blind, clear eyes that seemed to look deeper than sight allowed. And though he didn't speak, though he hadn't said a single word since the day he laid $5 on a card in Prescott, his silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. The land beyond the butte was dry and quiet, a cradle of earth held together by stone, scrub, and sky. Trace's cabin sat crooked under the slant of the hills, its roof sagging in places, its chimney coughing thin smoke like old breath. The barn leaned against the wind, patched with mismatched boards and stubborn nails. A narrow stream curved behind it, its water moving slow and secret, like a memory whispered too many times. Nothing about the place was beautiful, not in the way people wrote about. But it was honest. It didn't pretend. He led her there without a word. She followed, her hand brushing the mare's side, cane tapping the hardened ground in rhythm. When they reached the porch, she paused, one bare foot resting on the bottom step. She tilted her head, listening. "There's a song in this place," she said. "The wood's old. It remembers." Trace said nothing. He only nodded toward the door and stepped aside. She found the frame with her hand, fingers gliding over the grain, and crossed the threshold without hesitation. Inside, the space was spare, just a table, a bed, and a stove that creaked when it breathed. Dust caught in shafts of amber light slicing through the shutters. He set her satchel down in the corner, poured water from a jug into a tin cup, and left it near her hand. No welcome. No instructions. Just presence. She drank slowly, then asked, "Do you have a name?" He looked at her. That same pause, then a small tilt of his head. "Trace," she answered for him, tasting the word, like something faint, but not gone. The days settled into rhythm, like footsteps on a path neither of them had walked before but somehow knew. At dawn, he chopped wood. She swept the floor by feel, moving with a grace that made the dust ashamed to rise. He carried buckets from the stream. She cooked by scent and the way dough felt between her fingers. The quiet stretched around them, not heavy, but warm, a blanket neither wanted to lift. She rarely spoke unless she had something worth saying. "I hear birds you don't hear," she told him once as they sat on the porch. "The land speaks differently when you close your eyes." He carved a railing along the porch after that. Slowly, carefully, with hands that hadn't made anything gentle in years. Not for her. Not out of pity. But because something about the way she leaned forward when she listened to the wind made him want her to stand safe. When she ran her fingers along it later, her lips parted just enough to say, "You didn't need to." But her voice carried gratitude, like the hush before a rain that never comes but still blesses. Nights were longer. They sat by firelight, the crackling logs filling the silence neither of them seemed in a hurry to break. One evening, after a supper of beans and cornmeal, she asked, "Why don't you speak?" Trace froze. Not in fear. In something deeper. Like a wall inside him had just heard its name. She waited, calm, eyes unseeing but wide open. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into a drawer and drew out a small harmonica, dulled with age. He raised it to his lips and played a slow, aching tune. It wasn't a song for company. It was a confession. Every note carried years of roads walked alone, of losses unnamed, of grief too thick to drown and too dry to weep. When the last note faded, she didn't clap or speak. She simply turned her face toward him and breathed, "Now I understand." The silence afterward felt fuller. The next morning, she asked him to come outside with her. The air was cool, still holding on to the edge of night. She led him a few steps past the porch and crouched low, her palm pressing flat against the dirt. "Kneel," she said. He hesitated, then obeyed. She took his hand, rough, calloused, built for tools and reins, and pressed it to the ground. "Feel it." He didn't. "Not yet," she whispered. "Close your eyes." He did. They stayed like that, unmoving. Then, faintly, he felt it. A subtle warmth rising through the soil. Not heat, exactly, but life. The soft hum of something steady, timeless. "That's morning," she said. "When the earth warms from below, like breath before it speaks. You can tell time by it." He looked at her. Really looked. There was dirt on her cheek, a smudge near her brow. Her braid was loose, curling strands falling along her jaw. She didn't seem fragile. She seemed rooted, like a cottonwood planted too deep to be moved. "Show me more," he said without speaking. And she did. She taught him to hear hoofbeats through the soles of his boots before they ever reached his ears. To know the difference between a mourning dove's cry and a coyote's yelp echoed off stone. To tell how far a storm was by the smell of sage turned wet in the wind. He watched her more with each passing day. Not out of curiosity, but reverence. She moved like someone who trusted the world, even when it had failed her. She folded laundry with the same care she used tracing the edges of the doorframe. She smiled without trying. She listened to everything, his silence most of all. And he, in return, began to listen, too. Not to words, but to her. To how she tilted her head slightly when a rabbit passed near. To how her fingers danced across the table before setting down a bowl, as if mapping the space. To how her voice stayed steady even when the fire flared too close. One dusk, as he patched the roof, he looked down to find her standing barefoot in the yard, arms lifted, palms open toward the last light. "What are you doing?" he almost asked. She answered anyway. "Sometimes," she said, "I forget what the sun looks like. But I remember how it feels when it leaves." He climbed down without finishing the patch. She stood there, waiting. He stepped in front of her, hand stained with pitch and dust, unsure what came next. She reached out, not with hesitation, but certainty, and touched his face. It wasn't a caress. It was an awakening. Her fingers followed the ridge of his cheek, the corner of his jaw, the bridge of his nose. "You see only with your eyes," she murmured. "But they are afraid." He closed them. "Let them rest," she said. "Let your heart learn to look." And in that stillness, with nothing between them but the breath of evening and the memory of a song played beside fire, Trace felt something shift. Not loudly, but deeply, like roots finding water in dry land. The sun hung low behind the butte, throwing long, copper shadows across the edge of the valley. Trace had just finished mending the east fence when the sound of hooves reached his ears, too heavy to be deer, too bold to be wild. He straightened, hand resting instinctively on the gatepost, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. From the rise came a rider, big, slouched in the saddle like a man who no longer feared consequence. Dust trailed him like a ghost unwilling to let go. The horse was tired. The man, more so. Trace knew him before he saw his face. There was only one gait that arrogant, only one shoulder that slumped like it still carried the weight of dead cattle and worse memories. Brooks. The name hissed through Trace's mind like snake grass and wind. He didn't wave. Didn't greet. Just rode up, dismounted with a grunt, and tied the reins lazily to a leaning post. A flask swung from his belt, half empty, the rest sloshing like secrets that couldn't drown. "Well, I'll be damned," Brooks said with a grin that never reached his eyes. "Trace Whitlock. Still walking the earth after all that time. And here I thought you'd vanished into that silence of yours for good." Trace didn't answer. He didn't nod, didn't blink. Just stood there, the lines in his face deepening like cracks in old timber. Brooks took a pull from the flask, then glanced past him, toward the cabin. She was standing on the porch, still as a statue carved from dusk. Saying, her cane rested against the doorframe. Her hands were folded in front of her. She looked straight ahead, unseeing, but there was a sharpness in her stillness, a knowing. Brooks chuckled. "Well now, ain't this a story?" He turned back to Trace. "She yours, or just something you're feeding?" The wind dropped out of the world. Trace didn't flinch, didn't move, but the way his shadow grew long behind him, the way the silence deepened like a well with no bottom, that said more than fists ever could. Sands' voice drifted from the porch. Soft. "Sure. He brings something broken." Brooks looked back at her and smiled crooked. "You'd know about broken, wouldn't you, girl?" Trace's boot shifted a half-inch in the dirt. Brooks held up a hand. "Easy. Just passing through. Thought I'd say hello. Reminisce, maybe." Trace's jaw clenched. He didn't need to hear the words to remember the taste of the smoke, the ash on his tongue, the screams he hadn't been able to drown, even when silence became his only prayer. Brooks leaned on the fence rail. "You know, it's funny. Last week I ran into Lieutenant Vance down in Wickenburg. You remember Vance? Bayonetman. Real loud. Still telling stories about the day we rode through Painted Mesa. Burned out in Apache camp. What, 12, 13 years back." He took another swig. "Hell of a fire. Lot of shouting. Women screaming. You didn't shoot, if I remember right. Just stood there. Frozen stiff like your soul forgot what side it was on." Trace didn't breathe. Brooks's tone dipped low. "We left 'em piled. Small Darren. Some of the boys said they saw a girl crawl out of the ash. Thought she was dead. But she lived. Blinded, maybe. But alive. One of 'em said he still dreams of her." Sand hadn't moved, but her lips parted slightly, as if catching wind from another lifetime. Brooks smirked. "Small world, huh?" Trace's fists were white around the fence rail now. Not from rage, but from recognition. From the unbearable weight of truth long buried but never forgotten. Sand stepped off the porch, barefoot, her cane forgotten. She walked slowly, the way a person walks toward a cliff they know they won't fall from, but must look over anyway. "Painted Mesa," she said softly. "I remember the smell. And the heat. My mother's hands pushing me into the clay oven, telling me not to make a sound. I remember the roar. The crackle. The boots." She turned her face toward Trace. And someone standing still. Not shooting. Not helping. Just watching. He lowered his eyes. Brooks laughed like a drunk man watching a fire he didn't start. "Well, damn, ain't that something? Your cowboy here might have bought you for $5, sweetheart, but sounds like he owed you a lot more." Trace's voice didn't rise. His hands didn't reach for the revolver at his side. He simply turned, walked past Brooks like he didn't exist, and entered the cabin without a sound. Sand stayed in the yard for a moment longer, then followed. Inside, the room was lit by dying orange embers. Trace sat at the edge of the bed, hands braced against his knees, body trembling, not from fear, but from the way guilt can finally find its way through bone after years of hiding in marrow. She stood in the doorway. He couldn't meet her gaze, though her eyes were blind. "I was there," he said inside himself. The words didn't pass his lips, but she heard them anyway. I did nothing. Sayan stepped forward, closing the distance like rain crossing parched earth. She knelt in front of him, reached for his hands. He didn't pull away. Her fingers were warm. Steady. The men who burned us, she said. They didn't stay to feel shame. But you did. He shuddered. You stayed, she repeated. You carried it. Every mile. Every silence. You never let it go. He looked at her then, and for the first time in years, he let the silence break, not with sound, but with surrender. His shoulders dropped. His head bowed. Sayan touched his cheek. This is not forgiveness, she said. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it's something else. He nodded slowly. A sacred pause passed between them. Outside, the wind stirred the trees like voices returning home. Brooks was long gone, his dust trail fading toward the rim of the world. Whatever he had brought with him had been heavy, yes, but it had also unsealed something that had long needed air. Trace reached up, one hand trembling, and laid it gently atop hers. And then, barely above a whisper, his voice cracked open, low and raw and human. Sayan. It was not an apology. It was not a plea. It was her name, spoken like a vow. Like a door opening after years of knocking. Like a vision finally learned by the heart, not the eyes. She breathed it in as if it were music. And in the hush that followed, the fire flickered once, then steadied.